Head kolleegid, alustame päeva teise sessiooni.
Colleagues, let us proceed with the second section of today, which will be moderated by Monika HAUKANÄMM, a good colleague from the European Union Affairs Committee. Over to you. Thank you, Thomas. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Monika HAUKANÄMM, and in addition to being a member of the European Union Affairs Committee, I'm also Vice Chair in the Social Affairs Committee. People, including people, and having people cope are issues with which I've been active all my life. This means that the section ahead of us is a perfect fit for that profile. In the first section of today, we heard people saying that debates about the future of European Union should focus on the citizen. The purpose of this section, this panel, is to hear people discuss what are the best practices and how we, as elected parliamentarians, can ensure that European Union policies meet our citizens' expectations. It's also very important that we explain to people what's going on the European Union level and what is the additional value that's being created. To help citizens acquire a sense of security, it's important to tailor our messages to our target groups. At this crucial moment, it's especially important to give people an opportunity of making their voice heard, presenting their vision, and of being informed about how the European Union is faring. Let me briefly introduce to you the speakers of our panel. The first speaker is Dr. Katrin from the Vienna Institute for Advanced Studies. The second speaker is Mr. Pieter from the House of Representatives of the Dutch Parliament. And the third keynote speaker is Mr. Kristian VIGENIN from the National Assembly of Bulgaria. The same principle that we based our work on in the morning applies now too, which means first we will hear the keynote speakers, then there will be an opportunity to speak from the floor, and we will afterwards hand back the microphone to the keynote speakers for comments and answers. So, colleagues, you can, starting from now, register as speakers for the debate. You can do that from your own seat electronically. And I have the honor of giving the floor to our first speaker, Dr. Katrin, who is Associate Professor in the Research Group on European Integration of the Vienna Institute for Advanced Studies. Her research focuses on Europeanization, multi-level governance, and in particular legislative studies, with a specific interest in the role of national parliaments in the European Union. Recently, she has focused on the interaction of parliaments with citizens and on parliamentary communication to citizens and media coverage of parliamentary involvement.
Madam Chairman. Mr. Chairman, distinguished members of Parliament, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank COSAC and the Estonian Parliament and the Estonian Presidency very, very much for inviting me today. It is a great honor, but it's also a great pleasure to speak on a topic that I not only focus on in my research, but that I'm also actually quite passionate about. To quote Abraham Lincoln's famous Gettysburg Address, the EU has made major achievements in terms of government by and government for the people. Government of the people, however, requires identification with a polity and a sense of ownership. We heard about this morning. In other words, it requires the perception that the institutions of government are genuinely the people's own. Yet too many citizens lack exactly this sense of ownership when it comes to the EU. Instead, all too often, they experience a very diffuse, but at the same time fundamental, and worse, growing feeling of disenfranchisement. Now, this is something that national parliaments cannot deal with alone. But overcoming this fundamental democratic disconnect, providing citizens with ownership in EU affairs, this is, from my point of view, one of the most important functions that national parliaments have in EU affairs. As the COSAC report, as well as my own research show, national parliaments have indeed made immense effort to provide information on EU politics. For example, by opening up and web streaming committee meetings, or by providing extensive access to documents on their websites. In terms of transparency, national parliaments are doing really well. But it is very important to distinguish between transparency and publicity. Transparency means that information is available. Publicity, however, means that such information actually reaches its audience. The provision of documents or minutes on the websites is highly welcome, because it's likely to reach specialist audiences that can act as multiplicators. The same holds true for many of the other measures that are mentioned and listed in the COSAC report, the latest one. It is a truly impressive array of instruments that are being used to involve civil society and stakeholders. What I would like to focus on here is the question of how parliaments can reach non-specialist audiences. Let me ask you, how many ordinary citizens read parliamentary documents? How many citizens really choose watching the web stream of a committee meeting over the evening entertainment? Realistically, not all that many. So one option is, for example, to tailor information to more general audiences. And there are some excellent examples out there by parliaments. But many of the websites could present the information in a much more accessible and a much more user-friendly way. To give one example, short summaries of committee meetings that outline the important issues, but also the different positions of the political parties, are probably far more helpful for ordinary citizens than fairly technical documents or long stenographic minutes, especially if they have to search for them in extensive databases. Second, social media certainly have the potential of reaching a much broader audience, especially if we're looking at such popular formats such as Twitter or Facebook, which also allow for feedback by citizens and thus for a direct exchange. And here again, some parliaments have been very, very successful. Some of the EU-related parliamentary Twitter accounts, for example, reach several thousand followers. Yet most of them are academics, journalists, other politicians, representatives of NGOs or think tanks. In other words, they're all sorts of EU affairs professionals. The fact is, most citizens still experience parliamentary politics through the traditional media, by reading the newspaper or by watching the evening news. When we interview, colleagues and I interview MPs, we often hear complaints about the lack of media interest in Parliament, especially when it comes to EU issues. I recently conducted a research project that specifically looked at the news coverage of parliamentary EU activities. And it is true. It's true. We did indeed find that very much of what happens on EU politics in Parliament does not make it into the news. But plenary proceedings do. Of the thousands of articles that we analysed, roughly 2/3 either covered plenary EU debates, votes or interpellations directly, or they featured comments of MPs related to them. As a contrast, let me give you the number of articles on committee meetings. Around 4%. So clearly, parliamentary activity cannot simply be dictated by the media definition of what is newsworthy. But plenary debates are a crucial instrument of parliamentary communication because they allow citizens to learn about the issues that are high on the political agenda in the EU. But more importantly, they allow them to realize how they may be affected by them, to distinguish between different parties' positions on them, and ultimately to decide which of these positions represent their own interests best. In other words, they allow citizens to make informed political choices and to exercise democratic control, to take ownership. This is also why parliamentary communication should never be misunderstood as advertising EU politics or as doing PR work for the EU. The vital point is that parliamentary communication through plenary debates, it allows for different and sometimes even highly critical views on EU policy issues and decisions. And just as importantly, it allows citizens to see that their concerns are addressed and voiced, and that their representatives hold the government accountable for EU policies. Now, parliaments certainly don't have the capacity to debate each and every EU issue in the plenary. They have to be selective. But let me ask you, spending, as we found in a research project, on average 5% of the plenary time on EU issues is maybe a bit more selective than would be necessary. So I would therefore like to close with a suggestion that is also advocated by colleagues of mine, namely to focus more strongly on the European Council. European Council meetings set the agenda on a large number of crucial European issues that are at the same time at the very core of citizens' concerns, such as economic governance, the European semester, foreign policy, internal and external security, migration. We heard about all of these issues today already. European Council meetings also usually generate broad media attention. So maybe rather than debating at best a single statement by the Prime Minister directly before or after the meetings, parliaments could organize a series of debates around the meetings, which could then be flanked by very targeted input from civil society and a focused interaction with citizens via social media and online platforms. So in other words, parliaments could use the momentum to create or to serve as what John Stuart Mill called a Congress of Opinions, ensuring that their voice and through them their citizens' voices are actually heard. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share my thoughts with you on this very important topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. AUEL. Mul on hea meel juhatada sisse meie järgmine kõneleja.
I'm happy to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Pieter OMTZIGT, who is a member of the European Union Affairs Committee of the House of Representatives of the Netherlands. He has mostly been active with taxes, migrations, and foreign and European Union policy in his work. In addition, he is also a member of the delegation to the Council of Europe from the House of Representatives.
Thank you.
Over to you.
Dear fellow parliamentarians, democracy is not just about having a debate. Democracy is about taking decisions. And in these decisions, citizens should be involved. The big problem we're dealing with at the moment is that in the EU Council, and Ms AUEL just pointed it out, that's where the important decisions are taken. Most documents are not public before decisions are taken. So that's why the Dutch delegation, that's both houses, have written a paper which is available to you on the back on opening up closed doors, making the EU more transparent for its citizens. We translated it in German and French, and we do a concrete proposal because we think that this democratic deficiency is one of the main factors driving the distrust of certain citizens in the EU institution. Ms HÜBNER, but also Mr Barnier already talked about it, and President Kaljulaid made a big point of it this morning. In fact, democracy is something really easy. You have politicians, you have a government, and you have voters. The government takes a decision, and Parliament controls, checks, asks questions what the government is doing. And after 3, 4 or 5 years, depending on your constitution, your parliament is re-elected by the voters. And they can do that on the basis of the behavior they observed or on your new election promises. But key here is that the electorate should be able to observe what the parliamentarians have done. Now, the EU Council is a legislator as well. It's a legislator because it makes directives. And directives is EU legislation which even override national legislation. Within the EU Council, your Prime Minister or your Minister takes a vote on behalf of your government. And you, as a parliamentarian, and I, control the position of our government. But the whole problem here is we only get limited documents, which we cannot share with experts, which means that if the topic is not our own topic, it's very difficult to read what is in there. We have a prohibition to cite publicly from these limited documents. So even if you have a public debate before such a EU summit, you're not allowed to take the draft conclusions and say, this is a draft conclusion I do not like, I would like a different draft conclusion, because then you cite from the documents, which is forbidden. And this way, it's very difficult for us as national parliaments to take our role, and it's very difficult for our electorate to see what we're doing, because they cannot read the documents. Give you a few examples. The budget of the EU was rushed through over the summer and wasn't really discussed in any of our parliaments. Now, you may think, obviously, this is a combined and joint responsibility, and the European Parliament has a big role here as well, and the European Parliament played its role. But it gets more serious with things like the European Stability Mechanism and emergency support. There we even have the Eurogroup. And to tell you the truth, the Eurogroup as such does not have internal rules of procedure, let alone that we know when something can become public. The Brexit negotiations also have a special openness regime, which means that we do not have access to the Brexit portal as parliamentarians. So we cannot see the document which Mr Barnier is using. So we're not even talking about them being public. And sometimes I take one of the directives, the Data Retention Directive. We did not get the text. And in the end, it was the European Court of Justice which says that it was incompatible with European law. And then finally, parliaments had some influence. This also is a key thing to see. A parliamentary debate is aimed at making legislation better. If we're not able to control legislation beforehand, you can get bad legislation. You get no input from actors anywhere. This is a small schematic theme as we see it. The EU Council has confidential documents and sometimes even informal or secret votes. It's very difficult for us to control as national parliament, but the EU Council does make legislation which directly applies to the voter. Yet the voter has to see how we control the EU Council, which it cannot. So we really have to stop with the confidential documents. What we did is we went as Parliament, we asked for legal advice from our lawyer, And she clearly said that the rules of procedure of the EU Council are incompatible with the European transparency law. So the European Council itself does not stick to the law it makes themselves, yet the rest of Europe has to apply them. That's no way of working. The same holds true for the citation ban. And by the way, obviously you have the right to ask every document you want, but if you do not know which documents exist, for a citizen it's very difficult to ask for a document you do not know that it exists. And so it took people who were looking in the tax deals 10 to 15 years to figure out what tax documents exist at the European level. And until that time, we could not control the government. So we make 4 proposals to the EU Council. Instead of having all the documents secret unless not, we think they should be systematically made public. At the moment, about 65% of the documents is not public. By the way, the transparency regulation has got clear exemptions if it goes to national security, defense, an imminent banking crisis. Of course, there are things you do not have to put in a public document because it would harm the national interest of a country. So there are, under EU regulation, enough exceptions which make this possible. We think that the Council should adopt specific and detailed rules regarding the reporting on legislative deliberations. That means that we know what our government is doing. Third, informal but influential bodies, think of the Eurogroup, think of the EU 27 in Brexit formation, should start applying the transparency regulation. By the way, I refer to the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union. It says, any citizen of the Union and any natural or legal person residing or having its registered offices in a member state shall have a right of access to documents of the Union institutions, bodies, offices and agencies, whatever the medium. So whether it's an email or a written document. That is not happening yet. What we want, I'll take 1 minute, Chairperson. What we want is we think it's good that we write a joint letter to Mr Tusk, to Mr Juncker, Prime Minister Ratas and Mr Dijsselbloem, asking them for reaction on those 4 proposals and asking them to end their policy of not acting in line with their own transparency regulation. And the letter is there for signature on the document table by the heads of delegations. A few of you already signed, and it would be really helpful if you have as many signatures as possible. That should then be debated within the EU Council, and if you then debate it at home as well, that will help for the right input, and then return to it at the next plenary COSAC. If you want more information, you can contact us in the meantime. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr OMTZIGT. Järgmine kõneleja on...
Our next speaker is Mr Kristian VIGENIN, who is the chair of the Committee on European Affairs and Oversight of the European Funds in the National Assembly of Bulgaria. He has also been the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Bulgaria, MEP, and co-president of the Euronest Parliamentary Assembly. As a parliament member, he has also been an active member of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly.
Let me first congratulate Estonia, and especially the Estonian Parliament, for the active and constructive conduct of the parliamentary dimension of the presidency of the Council. I see that there are a lot of speakers already on the list, so I'll try to be as brief as possible. There is no doubt that today the European Union is at a historical turning point, facing dramatic challenges both from within and outside. Today, too many Europeans consider the Union as either too distant or too interfering in their day-to-day lives. They demand from the EU to deliver practical solutions to the many crises we face. They ask how the EU is improving their standard of living, their security, and they expect a clear answer. In times like these, the EU needs strength and determination to keep unity and to better respond to the expectations of the citizens in the areas of security, economy, social inclusion and others. The responsibility and the contribution of every member state to the achievement of the common goals should be visible, respected and adequately reflected in our decisions. National parliaments can contribute actively to the good functioning of the European Union. The effective involvement of national parliaments is fundamental to ensuring that there is accountability and legitimacy for the actions of the Union. More could be achieved within the existing treaty structure. Important improvements should be secured through the efficient and enhanced role of national parliaments and through actions collectively agreed between the national parliaments, the Commission, the Council and the European Parliament where relevant. We need to reconfirm the principles of community approach, clear distribution of competences and loyal cooperation. In that respect, the task force proposed by the European Commission on subsidiarity, proportionality and doing less more efficiently, I don't particularly like this title, is a good opportunity that we have to use. Effective scrutiny by national parliaments of the activities of their own governments on EU matters is essential. National scrutiny systems inevitably vary according to the national context. Whatever system suits the national context, it is vital that national parliaments carefully scrutinize the EU activities of their national governments and hold them to account. While each national parliament will determine for itself the best means of doing this, we can nonetheless learn from each other. COSAC could contribute to strengthening these processes. Also, national parliaments should have a greater role in considering EU policies at an early stage before hard and fast battle lines have been drawn. The Commission should do much more to show that it can be responsive to suggestions and concerns raised by the national parliaments, even if they are not directly related to the principles of subsidiarity and proportionality, but are in fact more policy related. Whether at this early stage of policy development or later on, if a yellow card is issued, the Commission should take seriously its duty of review and either withdraw or substantially amend the proposal in question. The role of national parliaments in EU matters has become an important subject in the debate over the democratic legitimacy of the European Union. Strengthening parliamentary scrutiny and participation rights is often seen as an effective measure to address the perceived democratic deficit of the EU by bringing Europe closer to the people. Yet the potential of national parliaments to contribute to the good functioning of the Union and thus to the democratic legitimacy of the EU depends not only on effective parliamentary scrutiny, but also on parliamentary communication of EU policies. Communication and transparency, vital in every political system that aspires to be democratic, are of particular relevance in the EU. Here, national parliaments are crucial as arenas for the communication of important EU issues and their national implications. This needs to include both policy communication, mainly through plenary debates, and the provision of accessible information, for example, through more integrated and effective national parliaments' websites and social media channels. In both cases, parliaments need to focus not only on the information needs of specialized audience, but also to those of general public. By communicating and debating European issues in public, parliaments can thus effectively contribute to making policy processes more transparent and offer citizens a remedy to the otherwise opaque procedures, the overwhelming complexity and the difficult attribution of political responsibility in decision-making beyond the nation-state. Now, some few practical practices that we find good, since that is the topic of our discussion. First of all, in the national parliament, committee meetings are in general open to the public. NGOs and citizens are encouraged to participate and/or to provide their opinions in written beforehand. A few months ago, the Committee on European Affairs has set up a Facebook page and a Twitter account. The aim is to make the work of the EU Affairs Committee more transparent and accessible to the public. Citizens can also send messages directly to the committee via the social media, ask for advice or more information, and also they can ask questions to ministers when they come for hearings, which are transmitted through the chair of the committee during the meeting. The sittings of the committee are live streamed on the website of the National Assembly. The plenary sessions are web streamed as well. The minutes, including verbatim protocols of all committee meetings and the audio files, are also accessible on a dedicated part of the National Assembly's website. European Affairs Committee has also established a video archive. And in addition to that, we publish a brief information or news as a summary of the decisions taken and topics discussed following every committee meeting. Finally, engagement with the civil society. The Council, a public council, was founded with an aim to promote a steady dialogue with representatives of the civil society during the planning and implementation stage of the policy-making process and statements on legislature, especially on the European affairs issues. The Public Council consists of nearly 30 permanent members, among which are nationally represented employers' organizations, nationally represented trade unions, National Association of Municipalities in the Republic of Bulgaria, academic representatives, and representatives from a variety of non-government organizations, including students' organizations. The Public Council advises the Committee in relation to parliamentary monitoring and oversight of European affairs, and also when it comes to parliamentary scrutiny of the government's activities in respect to the programming, the management, and the control of revenue from all programs co-financed by EU money and from the countries of the European Economic Area. The Council has regular meetings and provides its advice and opinion on law drafts and other relevant statements, papers and reports to the EU Affairs Committee. These are just few practical examples which prove to be quite successful in our work. Now I expect an interesting and inspiring discussions. As I mentioned, we can learn from each other and hopefully together we can bring the EU issues closer to the citizens and thus the European Union, the European project closer to them. Thank you.
Aitäh, härra Vigenin.
Thank you, Mr. Vigenin. Dear speakers, thank you for sharing your valuable knowledge on the topic at hand. Now we can move on to the debate, and you have the floor for interventions and questions for speakers. At this moment, we have 20 requests for the floor, and each member has 1 minute for their intervention. Colleagues, please stick to the time, and if you exceed your allocated 1 minute, then I will ring the bell. So let us start, and I am glad to give the floor first to Ms HÜBNER from the European Parliament.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I would like to say a few words on one group of European citizens, the young European citizens. And today the young people of Europe are far more likely than older citizens to share European identity across member states. And we could see in the British referendum that young Brits have more in common with their colleagues on the continent than with the older generation of the British voters. There is a kind of paradox, however, because polls show young people among the most convinced Europeans. At the same time, we see very few young people fighting for Europe. At the same time, I think it's worth noting that EU is very often for the young people a natural environment in which they grew up, and in natural environment you usually find flaws and deficiencies, and they often see Europe as stale and corrupted by political compromise. But when you look at what they say and their hashtags on Europe in the internet, you can see that what they want is to influence European policies. They want a greater participation in formation of political parties. They want new technologies to be used to make democracy more direct. And the last thing, they also want to be owners of European projects already now. And I sympathize with their impatience. Thank you very much.
Järgmiseks palun Tineke Strik Hollandist.
Frau Strik from the Netherlands.
Estonian Parliament for your hospitality. I would also like to thank the panelists for all these different perspectives, and you all underline how important it is to involve citizens for a more effective and democratic EU. A few years ago, our government finally granted our Parliament access to the Limité documents, and as Pieter OMTZIGT already made clear, we still can't discuss them publicly in Parliament or in media, nor can we let organizations and experts monitor and advise about the proposals in the Council. In its judgment on Access Info Europe, the Court of Justice clearly stated that public access to legislative documents is indispensable in a democratic process where citizens are involved. So judges seem to know more about democracy than our national governments. Let us join efforts to create pressure to disclose Council documents in order to align with union law, rule of law and democratic needs. But of course we should not stop there. As Mrs. Yule rightly states, reaching citizens require many more steps, additional steps as well. Different strategies are needed, but access to information is the first condition we need to fulfill.
Järgmine sõnavõtt palun härra Rasmus Nordqvist Taanist.
Rasmus Nordqvist and Norway.
Thank you very much for some interesting talks until now. The reason why transparency, I think, is so important is actually because transparency will open up to have actual political discussions. Because the big problem, as I see it in the national EU debate in Denmark, is very often that we go to a pro or con to EU as an idea instead of going down in the subjects instead. But to be able to do that, we need the full transparency. And also that's why I want to thank the Dutch Chamber for coming up with this initiative, with this letter, something we will discuss further in the Danish Committee on European Affairs later on. Because it is crucial that we begin to open up the processes and we get transparency, we get more democracy into our project here. Because else the citizens are turning their back to it. And we want the exact opposite. Thank you.
Proua
Christine Diffrin, Belgium, please.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Democratic deficit and a decline in faith in politicians and a lack of feeling of belonging to Europe. We know these old criticisms that unfortunately are still very prevalent. According to the recent Eurobarometer, terrorism is one of the major concerns of EU citizens. In Belgium, one of the 6 founding countries, where there has always been a lot of faith in Europe, that faith is declining. Even if Brexit, in a way, is part of the past, it will have an impact on the future of Europe. We talk about more social Europe and more work in defence, but even for now, enlargement seems to be frozen. And the view of Belgium and the Belgian government is calling for a greater focus in a number of files within a multi-speed Europe, whilst respecting the principles of subsidiarity and proportionality. But we do need to flesh those out. Less but more efficiently, but perhaps better above all.
Mrs. Ruta Miliuta, Lithuania.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just last week, in an open sitting of Committee of European Affairs in Seimas of Republic of Lithuania, we started discussing the issue of systematic consumer protection at EU level. We all know that consumer protection policy is one of the most horizontal EU policies. At present, consumer protection issues are regulated by roughly 90 directives. Therefore, consumer protection law and its practical application are complex and inconsistent. The responsibility for ensuring consumer rights rests mainly with the national authorities. In this context, we support the European Commission's efforts to update the regulation on consumer protection cooperation through establishment of modern, efficient and effective mechanism. We welcome the consensus that was reached on this proposal. On the other hand, we consider that some of the provision could have been more ambitious. All in all, stronger consumer rights, better representation of the interest and reliable mechanisms of their defense are the key ways to create better conditions for EU citizens and concrete steps towards bringing European Union closer to its citizens. Thank you.
Head kolleegid.
Colleagues, let's stick to the time limit and I have to close now the speakers list. Next, please, Mr Jaak Madison, Estonia.
Aitäh, hea istungi juhataja.
Thank you, Chairperson. And thank you, colleagues, for very good comments and speeches. What does it mean to bring the European Union closer to citizens? In my understanding, the more influence member state parliaments have, the more say they have in European Union policy, the closer that policy is to member state citizens. Which brings me to the initiative from last year by the United Kingdom, which unfortunately has been taken off the table by now or forgotten. The red card is what I'm speaking about. The purpose of this mechanism, the red card mechanism, was to make the European Commission give more weight to member state interests and wishes, which would bring the European Commission closer to member state parliaments. And therefore, a question to all speakers. Do you see a future for the red card mechanism? And is there a point to discussing it in depth?
Marina Berenghieri, Italy.
Palun nuppu mitte vajutada.
Please do not press the button.
Don't touch the button, please.
Asentur, okay. Thank you. La discussione sviluppata su questo tema.
Discussions on this topic should be based on the fact that Europe as a topic is something that is looked at by the electorate in all countries, but more often negatively than positively, criticized rather than seen as an element that can be decisive in solving problems. It is clear that it is no longer possible to respond to these signals, which are indeed more and more worrying. There is what we need is a campaign to ensure that knowledge of Europe is increased and deepened. This is a situation that cannot be dealt with just by exchanging best practice. What we need to do is ensure that the values of a united Europe are better known. The only possible response of this possible destabilizing influence is to relaunch an integration process in a concrete and not abstract manner. We have to look at policies, instruments that can better arm the European Union and ensure that it can relaunch the economy across our continent. We have to ensure that we can preserve the model of the welfare state and correct welfare, well-being imbalances that exist across the member states. This covers all sectors of populations. Thank you.
Oui, merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'd like to thank all the Estonians who've contributed to your successful presidency, and I'd like to thank our Dutch colleagues. I support them for their initiative. And not just because we're part of the Benelux group, but for conviction that when our ministers in Brussels are attending, they're there as legislators, and people forget that they can elect people who decide on policy forming in Brussels. They're not extraterrestrials. They're voted by our citizens to represent them in many institutions. And we have passed a resolution in the National Parliament to remove the EU matters from committee to plenary level to give it more visibility, as Ms Auer was saying, was required, and I would encourage others to do the same. A youth parliament is important. It's good to have exchange between members of European committees and MEPs with the youth parliament, and as a politician, we're also members of a political party, and we need to do European work at that level as well, at the party level, and have dialogue with members of our parties. I thank you.
Mr. Mihailo Andušić, Montenegro, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, it's my pleasure to be with you today at a COSAC plenary meeting. It's quite apparent that more work should be done on promoting the EU, not only its history and values of peace and prosperity, but concrete effects it has brought to European citizens. No borders, cheaper travel, better quality of food, preserved environment, no roaming. In this process, we, parliamentarians, should play the key role as democratically elected representatives of people. In Montenegro, citizens predominantly support the EU. More than 2/3 are in favor of our EU membership. The European Integration Committee has developed regular activities aimed at improving public awareness. Before considering draft negotiation positions, we organize public debates on certain chapters where we invite all public to participate and provide opinion on our progress and reforms which should be undertaken. Also, we organize debates in high schools in different municipalities with students who learn about the EU integration, where we answer very interesting and thought-provoking questions. Also, we are very active on Facebook and Twitter. We will be more than happy to share our experiences and practices with you and look forward to hearing more good ideas from EU member states. Thank you.
Mr. Georgios Georgiou, Cyprus.
Dear friends, let's be honest about this. Brussels decide, basically, and national parliaments just ratify the famous community acquis. Citizens abstain. In desperation, they resort to extreme fascist or racist movements because Europe doesn't listen to them. Inequalities rise. Millions of unemployed or homeless in Europe, and poverty, and I'm paraphrasing from a German philosopher, is like a ghost above the European continent. Europe needs to save its credibility and promote human-based policies so that they can provide answers to daily concerns of its citizens. The problem is not an emotional, sentimental one. It's a political problem, a class and ideological issue too. We want a Europe of monopolies or a Europe for citizens, and unless we opt for the latter, the national parliament's work will not get its true meaning, and that's how we will gain back the trust of citizens.
Thank you, Rovana, PLUMB, Romania.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, dear colleagues.
First of all, allow me to congratulate the Estonian presidency.
Issues they have chosen, and we'd like to congratulate them for organizing this COSAC meeting.
Today, we need to speak about
the moving of the EU closer together to citizens.
Because we speak of democracy here and a more...
To ensure that we have a more efficient Europe.
And in a Europe which is closer to its citizens, the EU institutions should not only be seen as regulators, they should be facilitators. They should bring together different stakeholders at different levels.
Europe as something more than just a legislator. We need to rebuild trust, the trust of the citizens of the European Union.
In the EU, and national parliaments should play a much stronger role in the new European project.
In the current challenges, we need to strengthen dialogue with citizens. We need to ensure that...
At the same time, we need to make sure that we encourage our citizens, make sure that they don't lose our trust in us. We need to make...
I'm talking about certain issues that erode trust, such as Romania joining Schengen, and that doesn't help.
Lose trust, avoiding the citizens losing trust in us. And here I'm referring to an important topic like the accession of Romania to Schengen, for example.
Iirimaalt, palun.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Madam Chairman, the Irish government is currently trying to bring Europe to its citizens and has opened a public dialogue on the future of Europe. We have done this across all social media, and it will be interesting to see the uptake from our citizens. With respect to the role of national parliaments, the problem in bringing European affairs to a national parliament is Parliament is quite tied up with domestic affairs, and unfortunately the blame game is usually played when European regulations come into being, and this is something that we will all have to look at. On the issue of social media that was addressed by the first speaker, social media cannot be a one-way system if we want true relationship with our citizens across Europe. And my experience is most politicians use social media as a one-way system disseminating information. We must engage with people. And finally, the Irish government has a parliamentary TV channel which is free of editorial control by any outside body, and we find that that has beginning to take pretty significant uptake from our citizens watching it. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Härra Bastiaan VAN
Bastiaan van Apeldoorn, the Netherlands.
Thank you very much. Let me first of all say, also on behalf of the Dutch Senate, that we think indeed that, as I already argued this morning, this is a key issue, transparency, that I think can and should unite us as parliamentarians, as we all have an interest to be better able to scrutinize our governments. Without more transparency of decision-making and more democratic accountability, I fear that the EU will have no future. But I would like to focus my question on the Eurogroup. As my colleague Pieter OMTZIGT just pointed out, the group does not even have its own rules of procedure. It is an informal group operating in a really opaque way that yet affects in its decision-making the lives of all citizens of the EU. If the EU has a democratic deficit, then EMU arguably is a democratic black hole. So we need to increase transparency, yet the question is whether this is sufficient. So I'd like to ask the panel to reflect about what more can be done to restore democratic accountability and control within, in particular, the Eurozone. Thank you.
Aitäh, proua Marinka.
Thank you. Ms Marinka Levicher, Slovenia.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. What do we do in Slovenia in order to bring EU closer to its citizens? We have the EU House, which is the Information Office of the European Parliament and the European Commission. This house receives many visitors daily. This is where citizens get answers to concrete questions on the European Union. They can go there personally, they can call or write an email. Many EU publications are available. Many are targeted at the youngest citizens. We also have organized school groups visiting the EU House. Citizenship education is important in Slovenia. There are many activities organized also for our youngest. The European Commission pays a lot of attention to the citizens' dialogue with the citizens, and there is many debates and discussions that are proving this. Many events are being organized and held regularly. Thank you.
Slovakia. Thank you very much. Let me start with a simple question, if you don't mind. What could be the EU's greater possibility to bring closer to its citizens than hosting one of the European agencies? Especially our Western and Southern European colleagues often emphasize the importance of European solidarity for a number of years already. Financial transfer to Greece, mandatory quota for redistribution of migrants are only the top of the glacier on this topic. When we then remind them that we expect the same degree of solidarity in the issues like construction of northern gas pipelines or agro-dotations, which according to the original agreements should have been balanced for 3 years already, their willingness to listen is often greatly reduced. Similarly, this is happening also when we are calling for the EU in which its member states comply with their own rules. One of such a rule was placing of European agencies in the countries where they are not yet present. The Netherlands, which is a new seat of EMA, and France, which is the new seat of EBA, are definitely not among those countries. Ladies and gentlemen, many citizens of Slovakia perceived last week's decision to place these agencies as unfair. We have submitted one of the best offers, and all of us hope that the recent presidency proved that our country is a decent place to host also European agency. Unfortunately, this doesn't happen, and Slovakia remains one of the few EU countries and only one in the region without EU agency. I'm very sorry for that, and when you next time ask me or my Slovak colleagues from where all of this Euroscepticism is coming from in the East, please try to remember this comment. Thank you very much for your attention.
Aitäh, härra Piotr WACH Poolast.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank you, all the speakers, for very, very good presentations. And I would like clearly support the proposition of that delegation, which was presented by Pieter OMTZIGT. It is a very concrete and logical proposal. In general, people in my country have different contradictory signals. On one hand, they enjoy numerous practical advantages from EU. On the other hand, they hear from politicians and from media a lot of complaints about bureaucracy, about the too many regulations, about costly and complicated system. What we have to do? I think we have to do three four things. Firstly, to understand the system well ourselves, then to simplify the system as much as possible, to explain the necessary regulations, and finally, make these regulations more open, for example, by approving kind of a deal that Dutch delegation proposed. Thank you very much.
Aitäh. Järgmiseks härra Kamal Isidor.
Thank you. Next, Kamal Isidor Shaker, Slovenia.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. The activity of the National Assembly in bringing the EU closer to its citizens has increased and strengthened lately. However, we are still not at achieving our goal. Despite the fact that our president goes to the European Council, and despite the fact that a lot of discussions are public, people don't really follow the decision-making process in the EU. The legislative acts are too complicated, so we need to find out how to directly communicate with the citizens and tell them what's everything about. We have an example of good practice. Our assembly redid the constitution of the Republic of Slovenia in a comic strip in order for everybody to understand it. But it's true, as I said, that the citizens do not follow the legislative procedures at the EU level, but also they don't really know what an impact all this legislative work has on its daily life. I can only hope that this will change in the future. We, the parliamentary committees, we have to strive for that. Thank you.
Järgmiseks palun proua Lolita Tsigane.
Next, Lolita Tsigane, Latvia.
That actually access to the information about the agendas and documents that are being reviewed in the European Council very much depends on the national arrangements that we have. And we have some wonderful examples here around the table. For instance, European Affairs committees in Finland, Denmark, Sweden, and also Latvia. We actually very closely follow the agenda of the European Council. We scrutinize the documents, and sometimes we feel that we have more information that we are able to digest in our very busy political agendas. I'm very happy that our decision makers, when they were thinking about the parliamentary scrutiny of EU policies, were looking at those excellent Scandinavian examples. And I believe that also our colleagues, for instance, in Netherlands, could see how they could implement some of these arrangements also in the domestic policy making. And then the frustration would be much smaller. Thank you.
Aitäh. Proua Idoia Villanueva.
Thank you. Now, Ms. Idoia Villanueva, Spain.
Thank you. We think we need to be more transparent when it comes to addressing our citizens' concerns. Our citizens' relationship with the EU needs to be improved, but we can't have unilateral communication and take a propaganda approach to communicating with them. We have had vetoes from governments over the last 30 years of policies across Europe. We need to look at regional examples. In Navarra, where we had similar problems, and we have taken measures to open the Parliament up to debate with civil society, with the participation of citizens, and during key events through the process they were physically present to involve them in the development of policies and improving knowledge and ensuring that we have round tables of representatives from different regions across the country, and perhaps we could take the same approach in Europe. It's too restricted at the moment. We need to open ourselves up to more involvement of citizens, and to open it up to their concerns. People have problems and challenges facing them, and the European Union needs to be able to hear the problems to address them.
Herra Jarosław OBREMSKI.
Mr. Jarosław OBREMSKI, Poland.
Dziękuję za głos.
Yes, thank you very much for the panelist intervention, especially Mr. OMTZIGT. But I'm afraid transparency isn't the only problem. Media are not not delivering information, they're creating emotions. And I believe politicians are following suit. And the EU is an excellent ground for this. Empty words replace real debate with the voters because it doesn't pay. And it's just a step away from populism. on any side of the political scene. Another problem is producing regulation. Over-regulation leads to people's indifference. I'd like to follow up on Mr. Madison said that perhaps the yellow card and the red card procedures should be the topic that we need to discuss, so that we send a message that Brussels is not a closed fortress and is ready to share its power with national parliaments and the citizens themselves. Thank you.
Aitäh, härra Simon Sutur.
Thank you, Mr. Simon Sutur.
The European Union must become a shared project of European citizens. Europe represents the common history, values and way of life. We have to defend this together. It's something we share. That's why we want reinforced European citizenship. Why couldn't we have a European identity card? We could encourage the European anthem being sung in member states after the national anthem. Mobilizing young people around the European project is important. Erasmus is a huge success. 3 million students and more have benefited from it. Why can't we have Erasmus for apprentices? National parliaments must guarantee subsidiarity. It's expectations on the part of our citizens. They want Europe to focus on essential issues. We're very active around this subject because we are convinced that Europe will only move closer to its citizens when they have a clearer idea about Europe's role. This is why we want more transparency, particularly in trialogues, more democracy. We need to reinforce the role entrusted to national parliaments and give them a right of initiative to ensure that the concerns of citizens are taken on board at European level. Thank you.
Thank you. And the last speaker, Mr. Hans-Peter Portman from Switzerland.
Chair, my dear friends, as a non-EU member, it is not on me to give you advices to your union. But when we politicians think about bringing state authorities closer to the citizens, I think we should first think about our own roles. We should come back to a behavior of being servers and not masters to our people. To be closer to our citizens, we do not need expensive trips or dinners or hundreds of limousines with drivers. Save tax money, like stop switching between Brussels and Strasbourg and invest this money on the real needs of this continent. We should stop to protect our seats for our own luxury cravings. We should take our parliamentary mandates as a gift where we are only obligated to the real values of democracy.
Aitäh teile kõigile.
Thank you to everybody. And now I will give the floor back to our keynote speaker for comments and answers. So we have all in all 10 minutes for this, which means everybody gets about 3 minutes. And we will go in the same order that we started. First, please, Dr. AUEL.
Thank you very much. I'll try to be brief. I would like to take something up that Mr. Madison mentioned, namely that parliaments need to be influential, that they need to hold their governments accountable, and thereby infuse their citizens' preferences, their citizens' interests into the European policy-making process. And I would agree with him. The only problem that I see with this approach is that the citizens don't see you doing that. So my point is the parliamentary proceedings need to be open up to the public, and this is why I'm such a strong advocate of bringing it into the plenary, because think about it, parliaments have over the last 20 years gained so much increased participation rights and control rights in EU affairs. But has that fact alone really regained citizens' trust in EU affairs? Has that really helped? A second thing I would like to address is how do we do this? And social media came up frequently, parliamentary TV channels. You will know the numbers better, but I know only one of BBC Parliament channel. it reaches on average 0.01%. Maybe other parliamentary channels are doing better, but I think this is not the way to reach citizens. So it will probably be through the more traditional media. Let me close with one sentence on the red card and then also on the green card. I think giving parliaments an instrument that actually forces the European Commission to reconsider legislative proposals, or in this case, legislative documents, would be a very, very good idea. But I would argue that the red card is, again, it's a reactive instrument. It's one that is probably fairly narrow, that has to do with subsidiarity control. So I would very much advocate developing the green card, because that gives parliaments creativity. That means parliaments can bring in their own ideas, their citizens' concerns into the European process. Thank you very much.
Aitäh.
Thank you very much. And now, Mr. OMTZIGT.
Chairman. I would start with Mr. Nordqvist. Indeed, you're not pro or contra EU, we're just lawmakers, and we're not for or against our own government. We're scrutinizing whatever proposals they do. And even though I'm in government, I occasionally see a law which I think we should reject. So rejecting an idea which comes from Brussels or comes from my own government doesn't make me anti-Dutch or anti-EU. It's just our work we need to be doing. They may have forgotten some angle. And that's why we need this transparency. Transparency you need at the point at which voters can still influence their politicians. Otherwise, the difference between transparency and publicity comes in. Publicity, pro-EU things are very important to explain what's going on. To our French colleague was saying this, give everyone the opportunity to have an Erasmus program, or do like me, study in 3 different EU countries for 7 years. I had great fun, but here we're talking about this legislation bit. Ms Miliute was very clear. Consumer protection is so incredibly complicated, with 70 regulations going on there, that there you're not for or against. You really, really want to scrutinize, and you can only scrutinize it if you have the texts, and if you can ask experts to tell you what these texts mean. Or you must be an expert in consumer protection. That's also my answer to Ms Chikane. You have the access to the documents. You are able to discuss them, but if you discuss them with citation, you have to do behind closed doors. So you have the choice in either doing it in full but behind closed doors, which I think is not the way I would like to do it. By the way, I have great respect for the way it's being developed in the Nordic countries, yet I think it should be out in the open whenever possible. And that's what our policy aims at. I agree with Mr Obremski that transparency is not the only problem, but that's the one we're trying to solve today. And on the red card from Mr Madison, yes, I think it would be a good idea. But I must say we've only had 2 or 3 yellow cards so far, no orange card. And it has existed since the Lisbon Treaty. So let's do it, but don't expect the world from it. And the same thing with the green card. Thank you.
Aitäh.
Thank you very much. Mr Vigenin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just briefly on my side as well, in a telegraphic way. First of all, we should take into account that here in COSAC we have probably the most pro-European MPs in our parliaments. I suppose this is generally the case, and we should take this into account because this is influencing our discourse here as well. Secondly, on the red card, yes, I support the idea of having such a red card plus some additional possibilities of national parliaments to influence the European legislation. But we should also take into account that with greater power, we have greater responsibilities. In that sense, we should not, basically, we should not ask for more than we can actually handle. So there we should try to find the best balance in the future debates. I think that in the biennial report that was presented this morning, you can find some good examples of the way different parliaments deal with similar issues, and I think we should continue our discussion also in the next presidency, specifically on this topic, and try and exchange more information how we deal with it. I think that anti-EU propaganda is very efficient because people do not know enough. When you do not know something, it's much easier to be misled. So giving more information on the substance, I think it's very important, in addition to everything else that we have discussed today. Changes we propose must be aimed at improving, not at impeding the functioning of the EU. Because sometimes you can find very interesting proposals from parties or people that actually want to destroy the EU, not to make it work better. So we have to be also very careful how we use the tools that we get. I mentioned that already. And finally, I think that we should be careful and stick to the level we have: European Parliament, national parliaments, local and regional, respectively, parliaments and authorities. I think that the strongest tool we have to influence the European policy through the Council, it is to scrutinize our own ministers who participate in the Council meetings. So there is a big area which is still not used. And in this direction, I think we should continue to work, especially in my parliament. This is an issue that we'll try to bring up in the months to come. Thank you very much.
Aitäh. Rõõm on tõdeda.
Thank you. I am happy to see that we can identify a number of different methods for bridging the divide between European citizens and the EU. I'm also happy to see that national parliaments are working ever more actively to increase confidence in and understanding of the EU. From the point of view of legitimacy, it is important to inform our citizens about political alternatives and also the wider context of what is going on in the EU. I believe that we all got some good ideas today to take home and to use for creating a more inclusive and better informed society. A cohesive and successful Europe, not understood and not trusted by citizens, is not sustainable. I also have a final announcement. Our Dutch colleagues asked me to remind you that the letter that they put together is available on the document table. It is waiting for your signatures, and if you have any questions about it, please turn to our Dutch colleagues. But I was very glad to have the opportunity to work with you. Thank you once again. Thank you, Monika. Colleagues, I would also like to thank you for sharing your best practices. Now it is time for coffee break. Let us have a bit shorter break. Our coffee break will last 15 minutes, and we will come back here 5 minutes past 3.